Nikdy není dostatek úvodních slov, takže já na vás ještě rovnou vystoupím s dalším. Děkuji Štěpánovi. Štěpán je náš národní koordinátor pro Českou republiku ve Studentech za svobodu. A protože on už vás přivítal v češtině a máme tady i dneska nějaké mezinárodní hosty, tak já se vás dovolím přivítat ještě jednou v angličtině. So I would like to welcome you today for our conference Stateless Solutions. For those of you who don't know us, we are Students for Liberty. We are an international organization that unites students who share the ideals of a freer society. And if you want to know more about us, just find anybody who has a pin or a colorful name tag and they will be happy to tell you more about us. Apart from Stepan, who is the national coordinator for Czech Republic, we also have the national coordinator for Slovakia here, who is Marek, who is standing over there. And we also have the European Programs Manager here, who will speak to you later on, Stefan. So talk to them and they will be excited to tell you more about us. And as Stepan mentioned, we also have partners who made this possible today. So those are especially Braiins, Fumbi, 3D Printify, Liberální Institut over there, and later on we will probably also meet Svobodný přístav. And I would just like to say that today we are speaking about stateless solutions, and the solutions is the most important word in the name, because when you meet libertarians for the first time, or liberals, or friends of your future, you hear them often complaining about government spying on people and about all the problems that they see in the world. And you might get the first impression that we are contrarians, that we are ludids who are afraid of technology because we are losing control over our lives, we are losing privacy. And this is really not the case. So libertarians are the first ones who will tell you that for every drone that is somewhere out there spying on people or causing harm, there is thousands more who are used in shooting films and exciting sports, streaming sports broadcasts, and many other users taking amazing photographs. And that all the technology that we often complain about that is used for the bad is somewhere else used for the best, and making our lives richer and more interesting, and making all of us more productive and more prosperous. So libertarians, even though we often talk about problems, we also have solutions, and some solutions we are going to discuss today to many of the problems that we face today, whether it is lack of housing and poor urban planning, shared economy, and environmentalism is an important topic of today, and we are also going to talk about how the market can face these challenges. So we are going to cover a lot of topics, and today we decided not to talk about problems, we decided to be positive, and we decided to talk about solutions. So I hope you will enjoy it. And just very last organizational thing from me is that because the pandemic is spreading again, and because we want everybody to enjoy the conference and to feel safe, and also because we are at the venue of a university where strict restrictions apply, so we ask you, when you are in the auditorium, to keep your masks on. We will really appreciate it. And that's all from me. And I will welcome on this stage our first speaker, which is Professor Kealey from the University of Buckingham, also an adjunct scholar of Cato Institute, who is an expert on biochemistry, and who will today speak about how the market can solve. We are starting to talk about the solutions can solve research and science, and whether we really need the state invested in this area. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you will enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's lovely to see so many students fighting for liberty, because liberty has no future unless the young generation fight for it. Now, I'm going to talk about how we have all been misled into believing that governments should fund science. And I'm going to talk about how this idea arose, and the solution is very simple. Cut taxes and stop funding science. I'm going to talk only for about 20 minutes, because my experience is that the question and answer session is always the best part of a discussion about the economics of science. So let me talk for 20 minutes, but let me just say that I've written a paper for this seminar, and the organizers have a copy of it electronically, and so I will talk relatively superficially now, knowing that you all have access to the original document. The story of the government funding of science is surprisingly simple, which is that on the continent of Europe, for many centuries, governments supported science generously because they wanted their countries to grow. But there was a very bad country called England, where the government was not interested in economic growth, and the government did not fund science. Which was the country that had the Industrial Revolution? It was the country where the government did not fund science. After England, there was another very bad country called the United States of America, and its government didn't fund science. Which country has for the last 100+ years been the richest, most industrialized, most successful country in the world? The United States. And it's Britain and America that hugely overtook France and Germany and all those other continental countries whose governments did fund science and universities and schools. There is no federal university in the United States of America because the federal government didn't see it as its responsibility. Federal government in America doesn't pay for schools. In Britain, the state owns no universities, contrary to myth. All universities are private, but they have contracts with the government. Nonetheless, the fact that all British universities are private tells you about the lack of state interest historically in funding higher education or research. So why does this change? Why is the United States of America now the leading power in terms of the government funding of science? It's quite a recent change. As recently as 1950, which is really quite a recent time, as recently as 1950, the federal government in America did not fund science. It had funded a huge amount of science, of course, during the Second World War, the Manhattan Project and all those other projects. But what is incredible, looking back at it now, is that after the war was over, the federal government dismantled all the agencies. The OSRD, Office for Scientific Development, was closed by the federal government. The federal government stopped funding science at the end of the Second World War. Now, in 1950, with the rise of the Cold War and the Korean War, the American government funded for the first time pure science. The National Science Foundation was created in 1950. But this was a very modest operation and was, in fact, a wartime measure. The federal government was worried that in the event of another war with Russia, they would need more scientists, and so they created the National Science Foundation essentially to train more scientists for the next war. Everything changes in 1957. And 1957 is the key date, because in 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik. Later that year, they launched the first living animal into space. A dog went around the world. And a few years later, in 1961, the Russians launched Yuri Gagarin, the first human into space. And this created in America what's called a moral panic. The Americans were appalled that another country had overtaken them. They were appalled that this other country was Marxist and threatened them militarily. And all Americans went to bed the night after Sputnik first circulated the globe, convinced that the Soviet Union was going to kill them all by dropping nuclear weapons on them from space. And so in 1957, almost like a switch, a light switch, America said, we must defeat the Russians in space, which of course they did. They created NASA, and the first people, men sadly, a very sexist world, the first men on the moon were Americans. But, and this I'm afraid is where the economics profession can be criticized. But, did this mean that the Russian model for economic growth was better than the American model? Did this mean that if Russia is going to overtake America economically, which is what everybody believed it was going to do, that the Russian model of state control of the economy was better than the free market? The same discussions happened in Britain. In Britain, everyone was saying the Russian model is better than the free market model. Look, they've defeated us into space. And if they can defeat us in space, they can make better washing machines and better motor cars. And Russia will crush us economically. This was a crisis, actually, an ethical, a moral, an ideological crisis. And a think tank in America called the RAND Corporation, which stands for Research and Development, which was a lobbying group for the government funding of science, employed two very distinguished economists, Richard Nelson and Kenneth Arrow, who in 1959 and 1962 respectively wrote the key papers that to this day determine all the economics of economic growth. If you are an economist and you go and listen to your professors, they will tell you what Richard Nelson and Ken Arrow said in 1959 and 1962, respectively. And what these two economists said was this: markets are fantastic. The Soviet Union is not going to defeat us because we have markets. We have perfect markets. And that was their theory. If you have perfect markets, if you have an infinity of competitors, an infinity of producers, the market is as free as possible, you will therefore have what the economists call Pareto optimality. With an infinite number of producers, free knowledge, we will defeat the Soviets, except in science. This is the one exception to otherwise perfect American model for growth. Because unfortunately, knowledge is a public good. That's to say, to use technical terms, it's non-rivalrous and non-excludable. I'll explain what that means in a minute. But basically what Richard Nelson and Ken Arrow said was, dear America, do not worry about the market. The more perfect the market, the greater the distribution of goods to everyone, except in research and development, because knowledge is a public good. Now, the problem with this argument is that it is very easy to show that in a perfect market, where knowledge is a public good, the private sector will not fund science. That is almost the definition of a perfect market, because you have perfect knowledge. That's the definition of a perfect market. You have perfect knowledge, which means no one can keep a secret, which means that the moment you as an individual try to fund science, all your competitors will know and the private sector will not fund science. Look, perfect markets are a myth. Neoclassical markets are largely a myth. We live in the world of classical markets, not neoclassical markets with an infinity of producers and an infinity of consumers and perfect knowledge. We live in the real world of classical competition, where relatively small numbers of companies compete with each other to sell the next product before their competitors catch up with them. And there's nothing wrong with classical competition. Classical competition gives you research and development because companies want to compete against each other to get the business. And therefore, in the world of classical competition, companies invest in research and development specifically to beat the other company. But classical competition is not neoclassical competition. And these two papers, bizarrely, if you read them, confuse, almost on a page-by-page basis, arguments from neoclassical markets with arguments from classical markets to prove, in inverted commas, that just because in a neoclassical market companies will not fund research and development, Therefore, in a classical economy, governments will not fund research and development either. And it was a story that was almost immediately discredited by Nelson and Arrow themselves. They very quickly said, Nelson and Arrow themselves very quickly shared this story. But it is a story that the world of economics has grappled, has stayed with, has been loyal to ever since. And if you go to any faculty of economics and ask about economic growth, you will be told that because knowledge spills over for free to other companies, only governments will fund the optimal amount of science. If you read Paul Romer, for example, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics 2-3 years ago, his work is about showing how in a classical market, so he's moved away from neoclassical markets, but how in a classical market, nonetheless, companies will underinvest in research because knowledge is a public good, and no company will fund research because it will be picked up for free by the competitors. Now, the paper here makes, I think, a very interesting point. It makes the point that we know how research works. And if you read about the sociology of science or the philosophy of science, there's universal understanding that scientists work collectively. In fact, it is one of the real problems of science that scientists, you read Thomas Kuhn or read Robert Merton, the economists, the sociologists and the philosophers of science have been building for the last nearly century on the observations of a Polish scientist called Decker, that science is collective. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, companies in Britain shared knowledge. If you look at what goes on in America today, competitor countries, companies share knowledge. If you look at the growth of the scientific and industrial revolutions, you see that the growth of these revolutions came by scientists who are competing with each other, coming together to share knowledge. And contrary to myth, industrial companies share knowledge with their competitors extensively. And this is because all researchers share knowledge. And the reason they share knowledge is that, in fact, if you want to steal someone else's research, which is a very noble thing to want to do if you want to make money, if you want to steal someone else's research, you have yourself to be a researcher. I, as it happens, know how to clone a gene. I bet very few people in this room know how to clone a gene. I cannot understand quantum theory or physics. I expect relatively few of you can. But if you want to make money in a quantum computer or something, you have to understand these theories, and the only way you can understand cutting-edge science is by being a cutting-edge scientist. Knowledge is tacit. Knowledge is open only to those who, with their own hands and their own brains, have reached the limit of knowledge. If you want to get to the limit of modern knowledge, you have to do it yourself. And only then can you steal the research of others. All scientists understand this, even in industry. And so the practice, and all the references are in the paper, the practice even in industry is for researchers, even from competitor countries, to come together and to share knowledge, which makes sense for everybody. If you have 10 people in the room sharing knowledge, you have a very, very large number of combinations of that new knowledge that everybody can share. 10 people can produce much more than 10 different combinations of knowledge if they each produce just one piece of knowledge. So you are all enriched by having access to the research of others, and you can all go off and make a great deal of money. The point I'm making is this. The sociologists of science and the philosophers of science have long known that science is collective. Thomas Kuhn, famously, with the whole business of paradigms shifting. Paradigms shift only with difficulty because all scientists agree on a model, and it's very hard to persuade them to shift that model. Scientists think collectively. Sociologists know this, and philosophers know this, but economists of science do not. Economists of science work to a completely false model of science, of individuals competing against each other. So even though economists themselves go to conferences and write papers and discuss things with each other all the time, they live in an artificial world when it comes to economic growth and science, in which researchers are all secretive because they don't want to share their ideas, and they live in a secretive world of atomized researchers. The world of research is very different from the world that Ken Arrow and Richard Nelson described, and that all economists continue to teach. Research is a cooperative, collective activity, not just amazingly with competitors, but because they're competitors. The only people it's worth sharing knowledge with are your competitors, because they're the only people who understand your science. But if you don't share knowledge with them, you won't get knowledge back, and they will overtake you. You have to share to get back. So, to conclude, Britain and America grew rich without the government funding science. As recently as 1950, Americans understood that there was no need for governments to fund science because they had become the richest country in the world in the complete absence of the government funding of science. Then Russia launched Sputnik, and the Americans thought, we too need to copy the Soviet Union when it comes to research. A very stupid idea, by the way, but we can live with that. Whereupon, two key economists came up with a theory of economic growth, which suggested that governments had to fund science because science is a public good, and only the Soviet Union knew how to do it. And by the way, in the paper, I even have quotes from Arrow and Samuelson, both of whom won Nobel Prizes, showing all this period of time saying that only the Russians knew how to run an economy and they would overtake us because the governments funded science. Now, for many years, it has been very clear that this is not true. And in the paper, I have a series of reports from American government agencies themselves, the Congressional Budget Office, the OECD, a series of reports showing that empirically there is no evidence that the government funding of science stimulates economic growth, and indeed seems to damage economic growth because of the phenomenon of crowding out. If the government funds science, the private sector stops. I talk about this in the paper. So why do economists still tell us that governments should fund science? Why do scientists still tell us that governments should fund science? Why do governments want to fund science? Why do industrialists lobby for governments to fund science? And the answer is, we don't believe in conspiracies, and we don't believe in conspiracy theories because we're sophisticated women and men of this age, and we're free of conspiracy theory. But the reality is, the nearest you're going to get to a conspiracy. Because who benefits from the government funding of science? Do scientists benefit? Yes. They get to live in lovely ivory towers and lots of lovely equipment, and they distribute money to each other solely according to who they think. Which scientists should get money is determined by their fellow scientists. Do economists benefit from the government funding of science? Oh, yes, they do. Every American grant to an American scientist comes with a huge overhead that the university spends on all sorts of facilities, including faculties of economics. Does the government benefit from funding science? Oh, yes, it does. People believe that all the good things in the world come from the government funding of science. For example, when the human genome was sequenced and announced into the year 2000, who announced that the genome had been sequenced? Who announced that the human genome had finally been sequenced? Bill Clinton, taking all the credit. And yet, ironically, this was funded largely by the private sector, but that's a separate argument. As for industrialists, because they don't know about the economics, they just assume that if the government funds science, their science is being subsidized by the state. They don't see the crowding out. They don't see that they've lost all their best scientists to the universities, and therefore their companies are actually suffering. So there is a, conspiracy is too strong a word, but there is a unanimity of interest Everybody involved thinks it's in their interests for the governments to fund science. And so, chronicled in the paper, report after report after report, even from the OECD, which is a government agency, even from the Congressional Budget Office in Washington, D.C., which is a government agency, and there are other government agencies as well, by the way, all of which report decade after decade. These reports go back decades. But the government funding of science has no economic benefit, and no one is remotely interested, because it's in everyone's interests that the government should fund science. And so tragically, and this is where the real tragedy lies, tragically, every generation of young economists is taught a completely false model of what science and research actually are. The sociologists know what research is, the philosophers know what research is, but economists have a uniquely inadequate view because, unfortunately, it's in no one's interest to be truthful about the nature of research. And I shall stop there, and I don't know how much time I have left, but I shall take questions here and after.
Okay, so thank you for the great talk, and now we have quite a lot. Yeah. And we have still quite a lot of time left for questions, so if you have a question, raise your hand and I will bring you the microphone and you can ask. You can also, můžete se zeptat taky česky a my to rádi přeložíme.
Thank you very much for a great speech. I have a question. You were talking about sharing of knowledge among scientists. I would like to ask you if there is or if there could be a market for knowledge where knowledge is bought and sold among the scientists. Not just the sharing for free, but a true free market.
I've never... Hello? Does this work? Yes. I've never heard that suggested before. I mean, some people believe that's what patents do, and you can license patents. Patents are a scam, by the way. Patents are a way of trying to do exactly what you've described, to commoditize bits of knowledge. The reason people, it's a very interesting question, thank you for asking that. The reason that doesn't happen is that people in reality simply swap. If you go to a scientific conference, the leading scientists who have information to share it with each other, but they don't talk to anyone else. If you look at what happens in industry, industrialists quite literally meet and share knowledge. So to answer your question, the answer is yes, it happens. People take out patents on discoveries, and they then charge license fees from others who wish to exploit that knowledge. And of course, companies can swap patents. That actually happens. So yes is the answer to your question, but it would be better without, actually. Markets don't depend solely on coins and money. Markets can operate in different ways. And you can exchange knowledge collectively or one-on-one without actually money passing across the way. But to answer your question, yes, people have tried it in the form of patents. But patents actually are a very incompetent and very inefficient way of transmitting knowledge. And in any area of science, surprisingly few competitors. I mean, we know we're living in the world now of social media where every company seems to be a monopoly. There is only one provider, Google, and all the rest of it. That is an extreme situation caused, by the way, by copyright and patents. But within a market, only so many people are trying to produce something anyway. And you can actually, within any area of research, form a relationship with individuals. You don't need to commoditize it. You can actually have a relationship. It is a form of barter economy. So to answer your question, because the market in knowledge, in any particular area of knowledge is so small, there's so few people involved in every individual area, barter works in that world. And the reason it's taken me so long to answer that question is no one's ever asked me that question before, so I had to work it out standing here. Barter is all you need in science.
Maybe I can reply because I was at many conferences and sometimes Mr. A is talking to Mr. B, right? Mr. A has a great knowledge, Mr. B a small knowledge, and I'm asking, well, is this efficient that Mr. A with great knowledge purely exchanges with Mr. B with little knowledge. You know what I mean? So this kind of barter.
What you're describing there is a university. If you look at the rise of the universities, it starts with the University of Bologna in 1080, nearly 1,000 years ago. And what was happening there, the reason the university was created was you had all these young men, they were men, I'm not being sexist, I'm just saying how it was. There were all these young men wanting to become lawyers, and they went to distinguished lawyers, and they said, please tell us how to become lawyers. And the distinguished lawyers said, you have nothing to offer me in return. I'm prepared to talk to other distinguished lawyers because we can share knowledge. But you, a mere student, have nothing to give me. And then the students of Bologna said, well, we have money. And because they're dealing with lawyers, suddenly the lawyers became very interested. And so the first university in the world was created by people with knowledge, being asked by people who had no knowledge to share it, and they agreed to do it for money. So to answer your question, knowledge from those who have it to those who don't have it, yes, money is useful. Knowledge between two sets of people who both have knowledge, barter is all you need. And that is a most interesting succession of questions, and I'm very grateful for making me think in those ways, so thank you.
Okay. So do we have any more questions? Ještě má někdo dotaz? Ještě máme dost času. Just raise your hand and I will come up with the microphone. Yeah.
Okay, so often when I'm talking with someone who advocates for government's funding science, and I present our arguments that the governments don't need to fund the science, they often bring up the base research, for example, some parts of mathematics, research of mathematics especially, and their argument is, look, if the governments wouldn't fund the mathematics, the companies wouldn't fund the mathematics because it has no direct output which can they solve. Sorry. So how would you respond to this argument?
That is a very good question as well, but I've had this question before, so I can answer more quickly than I did the first question. This is based on the assumption, your question, that there is basic knowledge which leads to applied knowledge which leads to economic growth. And because the basic knowledge has no immediate application, only governments will fund it. But this linear model is a fiction. It is a fiction produced to justify the government funding of science. If you look at the history of science, particularly the Industrial Revolution in England and the later 20th century Industrial Revolution in America, you actually see that the line is different. You start off with a technical problem. You research, this is a company. Your company researches this technical problem and produces solutions, but it also produces pure science almost as an accident. So, for example, take the science of radio astronomy. Radio astronomy now is a very complicated science with all these huge telescopes funded by the government to look at all the stars. But radio astronomy came out of Bell Labs, an industrial lab in America. So the scientists, or the technologists rather, were trying to create these long telephone wires, this was about 100 years ago, and the longer the wire, the more the noise. And one day, one of the Bell Lab scientists said, well, perhaps, so they looked up and discovered that this noise was coming from the stars. Then Bell Labs discovered not just that stars, they then discovered the background radiation from the Big Bang. All this came out of Bell Labs. In fact, Bell Labs has won so many Nobel Prizes, it's extraordinary. The reality of the development of science historically before the government comes in is that it starts with a technical problem, and in solving the technical problem, you often come up with things like maths or radio astronomy, I mean, so many discoveries come accidentally. The laws of thermodynamics emerged because the English, I'm not being nationalist, I'm just being historical, the English discovered the steam engine, And then someone said, well, how does that work? And then they discover the laws of thermodynamics. So your question is only valid if you assume what's called the linear model, basic science, pure science. But if you actually look at how science actually works, it comes out of technology, and science is a product, but plenty of it. The English dominated science in the 19th century the way the Americans did until 1950, simply because the growth of industry was so great that the pure science came out as a consequence. And the most way we can show this is to look at American economic growth. America has grown, and I say America because it was like a light switch. Suddenly, in 1950, we'll wait for these people to pass. America is like a light switch. Before 1950, the American government doesn't fund science. I mean, to a degree that's just amazing. So many of you will have seen the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. When Smithson gave the money in the 1840s for this institution, many American senators voted against accepting it. Even though this money was a gift to the American government, the feeling was the American federal government should have nothing to do with science. It was a private function, to the extent that there was resistance even to accepting the money. That's how much America did not fund science. And between the foundation of the Republic in 1783 and 1950, the American government does not fund science. And then suddenly, like a light switch, and especially after 1957, the American government floods money into science. We've all seen, I mean, American science is now globally dominant. What was the effect on GDP per capita growth in America? What was the effect on total factor productivity growth in America? GDP per capita growth, no impact. It's been growing at 2% a year since around 1800, and it just carried on growing at 2% a year. Total factor productivity growth actually went down. Now, that's probably a coincidence, nothing to do with that. But no one can show ever that the government funding of science has ever stimulated economic growth. Therefore, to come back to your question, if basic science is so important, and if only governments can fund basic science, well, we've disproved it, because the American government has been pouring money into basic science. By the way, the German and French governments were pouring money into basic science in the 18th and even 17th centuries, and none of these produced economic growth. And the reason is basic science comes out of industrial technology and not the other way around. The other way around is a myth propagated by university scientists who are trying to conspire against the taxpayer.
We still have time for at least one more question, if anybody's interested in asking. Yeah.
Thank you. If private foundations of science is more effective than public one, I guess in theory it should lead to conclusion that it becomes more and more common because it shows its effectiveness. And do you see some pattern in public knowledge? Does privately, because I think we can agree that privately funded science is not so common. And do you have some empirical data? Well, how do you see the future? Does the situation differ somehow in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Europe?
Yeah, actually, it's curious. We don't see what's happening. There has been a huge privatization of research. Now, research is not the same as basic science. So if you look at the entire world of research and development, it's that big, and basic science is only a part of it. But if you look globally, there has been, again, the references are in here, a huge withdrawal of governments everywhere from research and development, which is this wider thing. And 40 years ago, governments everywhere funded something like 2/3 of all research and development. And many companies wanting to do R&D, research and development, would write grants. Honestly, when I was a boy, governments would write grants to the government. Companies would write grants to the government as if they were charities asking for money for their research and development. This doesn't happen anymore. And over the last 40 years, there has been a huge withdrawal of government funding for research and development everywhere. And now governments basically only fund basic science, medical science, because that's what people want to see happening, space science, if they're in that game, and defense science and environmental science, because everyone is concerned about global warming. But these are really quite small categories, and we've seen the American government and all Western governments hugely withdraw from funding research and development. The consequences have been zero. I mean, economic growth has continued unchanged. Even basic science now, and we just don't see this because, in contrary to myth, companies fund so much basic science because they need it, by the way. Even basic science now is something like 50% funded by the private sector, which is extraordinary when you consider how the governments have tried to monopolize it. So to answer your question, there is a ton of empirical data out there showing that governments don't need to fund basic science, and that if the government doesn't fund basic science, Japan's a classic example. For historic reasons, Japan essentially didn't fund basic science until around 1990. And yet the Japanese economy, of course, was the great poster boy of the Western world, or the capitalist world. The terrible thing about empirical data is this, and then I shall end my talk. There is a ton of more than a ton. There are tons of empirical data showing that governments do not need to fund science. No one ever refers to it. Even the people who produce the empirical data don't like to refer to it. So in the paper you all distributed, I have two references, one to the OECD and one to the Congressional Budget Office in DC. The authors of this work are transparently embarrassed by their own findings. These people do not want to report that governments need not fund science. And so there is a denial of the empirical data because it's in no one's interests to see this empirical data. And so if I have a final conclusion, it's even bigger than the government funding of science and the government support for economic growth. There's an even bigger conclusion. If you want truth to emerge, even within an academic community, you need a vested interest out there somewhere to argue against any particular thesis. And if all the vested interests are aligned, you can produce all the empirical data you like, and it will just be forgotten. As Thomas Kuhn explained, once you have a paradigm, unless someone has a very strong motive in destroying that paradigm, it'll just carry on forever. So yes, to answer your question, there's a ton of empirical data, and everyone prefers to look the other way.
Okay, so thank you again for your talk. That was a great conclusion.